Welcome to the Grief Ladies, the practical guide to what comes next. I'm Kelly Daugherty.
And I'm Karyn Arnold, and we are two grief professionals with over 50 years of combined experience. We're here to validate, educate, and give you tangible tools you can actually use.
Each episode motivates you to take action and reminds you it's okay to want to feel better. This is the Grief Ladies, a guide to what comes next. Hello and welcome. I'm Kelly Daugherty.
And I'm Karyn Arnold.
And we are so excited to have you here to listen and to what to expect from this awesome podcast. So first, we're going to go ahead and get you to know us a little bit better. So I'm going to backtrack. A few years ago, I set on a path to do a collaborative grief book. And I had to find 24 authors to join me in this collaborative book. And it was a little nerve-wracking, I'll be honest about that. But I think one of the best things that came out of doing a collaborative book was the amazing authors that I got to work with and got to meet and become friends with. And so Karyn Arnold was one of my co-authors in the book called The Grief Experience, Tools for Acceptance, Resilience, and Connection. And so out of that book came, I think, a great friendship and a great collaboration. And we've been doing some things together. And so, Karyn, would you like to kind of share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Kelly said, being an author in the book was just this wonderful opportunity to be meeting other people and to be putting a wonderful book together. But then, of course, I don't know, Kelly and I guess we just found that we really had a similar mindset. There's a lot of people out there doing grief work and with different approaches. And I think we just found ourselves really being in alignment on a lot of things. And I don't know, a lot of it started with us just having phone calls talking about grief stuff and like nothing else. And we just really kind of enjoyed that. And then we kind of said maybe we should do like a YouTube and, we've kind of gone from there. But we're actually really on the cusp of something very exciting in terms of what we are building and working on. And the podcast is kind of laying the foundation for some of that. And I think is going to be an introduction to a lot of people for what we are doing. So, yes, I think we'll talk a little bit just briefly. We always say we have combined 50 years experience, which, as you said before, makes us sound old, but it's 25 and 25. So that's not as bad. But yeah, we've been doing this really the same amount of time. We've had a lot of similar work, some things a little bit different, which I think is good too, because we kind of each have some of our own specialties. But, I think we both like a practical approach to grieving. I think we like the idea of providing tangible tools, being able to talk about it, of course, but people are always kind of wondering, what now? It's fine to talk about it, but what am I supposed to do with the information? What am I supposed to do with all these thoughts and feelings? So I think we've already been doing a lot of that in our work, trying to help people answer that question. But now we're going to be doing it more formally and kind of more officially. So I'm very excited about this, Kelly.
Yeah. So, Karyn, would you mind sharing with our listeners about what got you into the field of grief and loss?
Well, it's interesting because mine tends to be a little bit more backwards in some sense. It is work that definitely found me. I started out pretty early on in my career. I knew for sure that I wanted to work with people. I was actually working with seniors at the time. I lived in New Jersey. I worked at a place called the Senior Health Network, and I was approached by my boss and asked to run some support groups. Was in my mid 20s. So like, okay, I had certainly gone to school and, done some internships and things like that. But from a professional perspective, it was my first time doing that. And what an interesting way to start it, because I just kind of got thrown into it and started doing bereavement groups. And it still sounds odd to say. It was odd to say at the time, but I just loved the work. All my friends and peers were in their 20s and they're asking what I'm doing, and I'm telling how much I love it and I love doing this grief work. But I stopped short of calling it a calling, but it is work that found me, and that I have just felt such a connection to. And it just kind of grew from there. I moved back to Pennsylvania, worked for a hospice for 17 years, then started Grief in Common, which is the website I have that has, groups and individual support, connection and things like that. So I think what has brought me to this work or maybe kept me at this work is just working with the people themselves and finding it to be very inspiring in a lot of ways. Of course, I get asked oftentimes, isn't it so sad? And, it is. But I also say to people, but I get to talk about love every day, all day, since we know that's at the heart of what grief really is. And I feel very fortunate to do that. I love seeing people surprise themselves with the things that they're able to do and sort of achieve through their grief, things they never thought they'd be able to handle or survive. People are so much more adaptable and more resilient than they could ever give themselves credit for. And it's wonderful to see. And, of course, I've had some pretty significant losses in my life along the way. And doing this work has helped with that and being with grieving people and grieving professionals. So that hasn't taken away, that's only enhanced, I think, what I'm able to do. So as I said, kind of went a backwards way and in, but here nonetheless. But what about you, Kelly?
Well, so my mom died from breast cancer when I was 14 years old. And I was really struggling afterwards, obviously, as I think any teenager would be. And my dad fortunately recognized that I was struggling. And I went to an all girls Catholic high school at the time. So I was a little boy crazy at that point. I was 15. And my dad recognized, like, okay, we're going to use this. And basically told me there'd be boys at the hospice grief group that he wanted me to go to, which is the reason I went. I walked into that room though, and my life changed. And there were no boys in that group, but I kept going because I finally didn't feel alone in my grief. Being able to connect with other girls who had also experienced parent loss was huge. And I just understood better what I was going through. And I met an amazing social worker who is truly the reason I'm talking to all of you today. Her name was Rainey, and she really helped me. She sent me home with books all the time. I was always wanting to learn more, understand grief better. And then after a while, she asked me to start volunteering with the children's programs. And that's when I knew that this is what I wanted to do with my life. So I got my master's in social work from Florida State, volunteered at hospice all through college, got my first job as a bereavement counselor at a hospice. And then throughout my career, I've worked at another hospice and done some other things. And then in 2017, I made the shift to go into private practice for myself here in upstate New York. And I now primarily focus on grief and loss, doing individual and group counseling with children and adults. And I truly believe that everything I went through is the shaped who I am today and is the reason I'm doing what I do. It's how I find meaning in my grief. And I'm just so grateful that I took something so difficult and challenging and turned it into an entire life, right? An entire career. I wouldn't have ever met Karen or even done a grief book if all of that hadn't happened.
Yeah.
And as Karen and I have talked about on our YouTube channel that we used to have from grief to growth. My dad died in November of 24, and so I'm back in a new grief experience for me as an adult and not having either parent now. So that's been a new thing, and also I'm relearning grief all over again in a very different way as an adult.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. It's like, we have a number of different types of losses. And, um, when something has happened, I find a lot of times people are often surprised that a newer loss brings up feelings from something that happened a long time ago, but it gets very compounded. Maybe
Mhm.
especially with parent loss, but I think it happens with a lot of things. So
Mhm.
I think sometimes we feel like, "Hey, I've done this before. I should be better at this, or I should know what I'm doing, or it shouldn't be as hard." But I think sometimes in some ways there could be an added element to it because we are pulling in, parts of our history and kind of adding on to that. So,
Yeah.
Kelly, do you think in terms of the work that you do, maybe not necessarily a philosophy per se, but are there things that you use in your approach, that you bring into your work, whether it's your writing or your groups, your individual, or even what you and I are going to be putting together, which we're going to be talking about pretty soon?
I think for me, It's my ultimate goal, and I know as a therapist, right, it's not supposed to be what my goal is, but I do have a goal for all of my clients, and I think that really, puts me on a path of how I'm going to work with the client, and it's really to be able to shift their focus from focusing on the death to focusing on their loved one's life.
Hmm.
We get stuck on that ending. We get stuck on that death scene. That's what we focus on. That's what we ruminate on. We think about over and over again, especially if it was traumatic. And we get stuck on that. Our brain is like Velcro to the bad and Teflon to the good. And so we are focusing on such a short amount of time rather than somebody's full life.
Mm.
And so my goal is to be able to help my clients remember the full life and to maybe even get to the point where they can celebrate their loved one's life and feel gratitude for having them in their life and all of those amazing memories.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would say something very similar. The words I use a lot are wanting to help a person eventually grieve with love instead of pain.
Mhm.
Because and in the beginning, we don't have a choice. There's just so much that a person is being bombarded with, so it's trying to be realistic and mindful of the fact that there's no timelines, that this follows a different path, for all people. And it's interesting because I think we kind of go back and forth with that, like, how unique everybody's loss is. But yet, I also spend a lot of time with people on commonalities and the
Mhm.
things, that a lot of people who are grieving have in common. For me, I'm looking mostly at, okay, this is what's happened. This is where you are. Where do we go from here? And trying to help a person understand what their choices are. I think in grief you feel like all of your control has been taken away from you, and that's a really difficult way to be, especially when we feel like part of the stress in earlier parts of our life are all the decisions I have to make, all the choices I have to make, and now all of my choices feel like they've been taken away. So I try to think of our time together as like the starting point and where our choices and our decisions can begin again. Where do we go from here? What's going to be our perspective? What path am I going to choose? It doesn't feel like a choice, but it's the difference, I think, between people who are able to begin participating in their life again versus those that may be feeling held back.
Yeah, absolutely, and not feel guilty about that,
Right. Right.
right? So I think those are things that we're gonna be talking about in this
Hmm.
podcast. I think that Karen and I both have a pretty, common approach and that we wanna help our clients. We wanna help people feel better, right? We don't wanna stay stuck, and it's more than just holding space for somebody, right? It is about giving people maybe tools, tangible steps that can actually help them on their grief journey, and I think that this is what this podcast is going to do. So, just a little bit of information about what our goal is with this podcast is we are going to give you tangible steps. We're going to give you tools, expert insights to help you on your grief journey, not just to be surviving, but maybe even thriving. And we're going to go through specific steps in our grief framework, which we'll talk about more in a minute, that's really going to help you be able to rebuild your life. And so each week, we are going to launch a new podcast episode, and it's going to be based on the grief framework. And we're going to give you those tools and those steps. We're going to maybe have some experts join us. We're going to have some listeners maybe join us and share stories, but also go into practical tips, myth busting things about grief that maybe is outdated and we shouldn't be talking about anymore. We really want to be able to give you clear steps of things you can do on your grief journey. That we always say there's no right way to grieve, but there is things to do, right? There are things that truly help somebody that are grieving, and that's what this podcast is about. So, Karen, I would love to know what if you'd like to share with us now about what this grief framework is.
Yeah, well, so grief is actually an acronym. And so just to take a step back for a moment, some people, listening, watching may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, which is kind of a Psych 101. It's basically the shape of a pyramid and it has the steps of, for him, the goal was self actualization, which, I think more people with like a Buddhist term would think of like enlightenment or something, along those lines. And the idea is that we need to get through one step before we can get to another. If a person is struggling to find food or housing or safety, they're not going to be able to have the complex needs of feeling self-actualized or enlightened. Like it just, we have to meet our basic needs first. So that's kind of what Maslow was doing. And I think through time with the work that we've done, we recognized that there are parts of that framework that are actually very true for people who are grieving. I found myself through the years, if I talk to somebody who's brand new, couple weeks out, couple months in, really in that early part of grief, I'm talking to them about survival and I'm talking about the basics. How are you sleeping? How are you eating? Are you getting outside? Are you taking care of yourself? Because without those things, how are we going to be able to do the next part? And I think that's sort of where the idea of kind of following this model of the hierarchy of the steps happened. So we want to turn this idea of, because we and I've both heard it, right? We've probably been with other grief professionals, even who have said, well, there's no roadmap. There's nothing that anybody can tell you to do. And I think through time, you and I started talking about it. We're like, yeah, but there kinda is. Like,
Exactly.
we're doing it every day, right? I mean, we are telling people, like, "Try this, you can do this."
Exactly.
Like, some of these things are gonna help and make a difference. And we have to also really maybe recognize what our goal is here, because we can't change or undo the events of the past. Nobody has the power to do that. Nobody has the control to do that. So all of these steps are that point that we're talking about from here. Where can I go from here? What can I do? The word I use sometimes is to make this more tolerable. As I'm going through this grief process, how can it be more comfortable, more tolerable? Those are the things that we're trying to help people till they can get to that point where they're like, okay, those people who are a little bit further out, I won't put timelines on it, but are ready for the what's next, looking for a little bit more purpose, meaning, activity, that kind of stuff. So that's exactly what these steps that we put together are designed to help a person do. Follow these steps kind of in this order, although some of them will have crossover, and you're going to see a difference. This is the work that we've been doing, and this is what has helped people is when they're following this. So, okay, I'm going to go through it step by step, letter by letter, what they each stand for. So, G, we'll start with that at the bottom of our period, stands for grounding. And that's our physical well being, just like I was saying before, the basics, the eating, the sleeping, taking care of yourself. Even when we talk about exercise, we're not talking about like, training for marathons or anything like that. And this also isn't about trying to fit in our jeans or in our bathing suit for the summer. We're trying to find sources of energy. And these are places where we can get that. So, like you said, with the people that we're going to have on, the topics we're going to be talking about, we're going to really take a deep dive into the grounding and into the physical well being. The next step is R, which is for rebuilding. And this is, I think, something people wouldn't necessarily think about as being important with their grief, but it's routine and structure. If you have had a significant loss, it's likely that your day to day has been significantly changed. What you're eating for dinner, when you're eating it, what you're doing this weekend, who you're going on vacation with, who's helping with things around the house, who you're turning to for advice or for decision making. It really upends a person's day to day. And I find a lot of people have this kind of empty space of time. And especially in the beginning, they're finding themselves like, I don't even know what I did today, struggling with motivation, struggling with feeling interested. And so the routine and structure in the rebuilding is really important. And Kelly, by the way, jump in anytime. There's anything that you want to
You're doing great, Karyn. No, I
add.
mean, I
Okay.
think we're going to obviously be going into way more detail with each
Yes.
of these letters
Right.
over the course. This is just a general overview, but yeah, I mean, there is steps and there's things you can do to help yourself. And I think that's what this is all just reminding us of, right? And I'm going to talk about, you always talk about a pivot. And
Yeah.
I love that idea. Like sometimes it's just a small little actionable step that we can take that can make a huge difference in our grief experience. And I think you explained one time to me about like a boat, right? You're driving a boat, you're going in one destination. If you just move that wheel just even slightest, you don't even feel a change, but you can wind up somewhere totally different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what this is about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad that you said that because I think sometimes the idea of actionable steps can feel overwhelming.
Mhm.
People who are grieving are exhausted. And the
Mhm.
idea that they have to do more or that they have to do something different or something else may sometimes feel like too much. So I think it's important to remember that these are gentle steps. They're small steps. Our life is made up of small moments. We think of this big thing, my life, but it's made up of bunch little small moments. And what we're trying to do is to make these a little bit more palatable, trying to make everything in our day to day feel a little bit more manageable. And again, going back to this R and the rebuilding, the structure and routine, which we'll get into when that week comes, is so important. And I really don't think people think about that, like scheduling themselves for things and creating some predictability, but it makes a huge difference. So we'll move on to I, that's interacting. And that's about communication and relationships. Kelly, I'm assuming you're the same. Every group, every individual work I do, we end up talking about the other people,
Mhm.
friends, family, extended family, coworkers, significant others, the people who just don't seem to understand, who maybe feels like they're rushing us along, who have expectations of us, are ready for us to be better.
Mhm.
This is a huge part of what makes this grief process challenging. And oddly, it's all the other people that make it more isolating and people feeling more alone. So this is maybe one of my favorite things to talk about. I think you know that.
Yep.
So the relationship stuff, improving communication. So lots to dive in on that. So that's our I step. E is for evolving. And that's where we're going to start talking a little bit more about some of the complex emotions, like what I would also call the grief roadblocks, the anger, the guilt, regret, resentment, any of those ugly feelings that are hard to think, hard to say out loud, but are so normal and so much a part of the grieving process. And if we are not working through those, nothing comes after them. I just literally at a call with a woman this morning and we were talking about this. And she has kind of two things going on. She's ruminating, she's second guessing, she's regretting, and then she's feeling very hopeless about where things are going to go from here. And as much as that's a really big deal, feeling hopeless about your future, until we sort of manage it, to find a way to make some peace with what's happened in the past, there is nothing beyond that. So that's really important. Also, self-esteem, which takes a huge hit, when a person's grieving. We're going to talk about that too. And then finally, F is finding. People talk a lot of time about purpose, moving forward. I think just being intentional, participating, what that looks like. We're not talking about purpose and like, why are you here on earth? That's sometimes too big, too scary. But what's getting you out of bed? What's keeping you interested, engaged? Where can you feel useful? I love that word. I think that is so important for people to feel useful. So, these are the things. These are going to be the steps. We're going to talk about all of this, and this is what we're going to guide you through. That's going to help you get to where you want to go.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be able to dive into all of these different topics because there's so much we can
Oh
be
my goodness.
talking
Yeah.
about and really being able to bring some experts in all these different areas because it is and I think our ultimate goal is right is how do you integrate your grief into your life?
Yeah.
And so I'm going to share a little snippet, but I worked with a little girl who had experienced a significant loss and we are at grief camp and at the end of grief camp she started crying. And so I walked over to her. Now this little girl is not a big crier, like never saw her cry in sessions. And she said, "I feel like I'm carrying around a backpack of rocks and I just needed to let some rocks out." And I think that's what grief is, right? We
Yeah.
have this backpack that's always there. Some days it feels lighter, some days it feels heavier, and some days we need to let those rocks out.
Yeah.
And by using these tools and these skills that we're going to be talking about, we can maybe lighten that backpack. Is it going to be gone? No. We don't want it to be gone, right? Grief isn't something we get over, it's something we learn to integrate into our lives. We're not going to help you learn ways to integrate it into your life. And understanding that grief isn't just emotional, right? It is mental. Grief brain is a real thing. You cognitively, right? It's also very physical. It's exhausting, as Karen mentioned, but it's also physical. The jaw pain, the stomach aches, the headaches, not wanting to be able to do anything. These are the things grounding, all rebuilding are going to be things that can help you. So, what makes us different, right? We're not just sharing stories. While they're great and we love to be able to connect and hear people's vulnerable grief stories, we're also sharing tools, things that are actually going to help. And while we understand that grief is universal, we also know it's unique for each person. It's as unique as a fingerprint, right? Each of us are going to grieve differently. So take what you like, you know, leave the rest if you're not a fan of some of the tools that we teach, but keep listening because they're each week is going to be different. And I really think it's going to be very beneficial. And so we're really here to be able to give you concrete steps to help
Yeah.
you on your grief journey, to
Yeah.
take action.
And really one very important thing to add too that I didn't mention before, because we talk about moving forward. And it feels like feeling better, moving forward, that these would be like obvious goals. Who wouldn't want to feel better and
Mhm.
to move forward? But
Mhm.
a lot of times grieving people struggle with that, because of maybe some of that guilt component, or maybe it feels disloyal or unloving. So, one really important thing to know is that as we're moving you through these steps, we're taking your loved one along. They are
Absolutely.
going to be a part of this. That's how we integrate loss into our life, is to be able to move forward but still feel connected. We don't want to just leave the past in the past or forget about anybody. That is not at all what we would want to do, and we know that's not what a grieving person wants. We are grieving people, and we are trying all the time to find ways to be here in the present, but to still feel like we have those connections. So that's a part of all of it too. So I mean, I think you're absolutely right with those things to remember about. And it's the physical symptoms, but it's also the habits. A
Mhm.
lot of times as we are trying to feel better, we think a lot about the short term and what makes me feel better in the short term. And that can lead to some long-term challenges. If we're,
Dealing with
indulging.
yeah,
Yeah.
gr grief weight. Trying to get rid of that. I indulged in a lot of gluten after my dad died. Unfortunately,
Well, and I
caused some
mean,
weight gain.
and people, listen, we feel like, who cares? If I've always been
Exactly.
so good with what I eat, and I'm really careful and I take really good care of myself, and then we just don't have the same motivation, the same interest, or maybe we feel
Mhm.
like we kind of deserve it. So, we'll kind of talk about that. And probably our first week really would
Yep,
be a good
absolutely.
place to start with some of that. So, I think, talking about what's coming next, we're going to be, I mean, there's so much material. One thing Kelly and I always talk about is that, like, there's so much to talk about, so we're not going to run out of topics. I know that for sure. And, we want to make sure that this is something that is going to be beneficial to you, and something that's going to be enjoyable to you. And something I say to all my groups, if there's something that you're interested in, or you want to hear more about, we would like to hear that as well. So, Kelly, final thoughts or anything else that we want to add for today? Like I said, I think we struggle because we know we're like bursting with the stuff we want to say, but that'll be the next time. That'll be the next time.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for listening. Make sure you subscribe. If you have a question, reach out to us. You want to share your grief story, we'd love to hear from you. The more that we're able to get this podcast out in the world, the more grieving individuals we're going to be able to help. And that's our goal. We really want to be able to help people. So, connect with us and stay tuned for episode 2, where we're going to come back and really start diving into that grief framework and really get into grounding.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's get started. All right. Thanks, Kelly. Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
Karen. Thanks for joining us on the Grief Ladies.
Don't wait to feel better to get started. Getting started is what makes you feel better. Put this week's tool to work.
If today's episode helped, share it with someone who needs it and leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you.
And remember, we're here for you, your trusted grief ladies, navigating this path together.